This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by Sound Porter Mastering, Atom Audio, OWC, Jay-Z Microphones, Spectra 1964, and Isotope. In fact, you're hearing my voice right now on the Jay-Z BB29 microphone through the Spectra 1964 STX 100 mic pre, C610 complementer, and Isotope RX and Ozone. So get ready to rock.
I think there's paralysis by analysis kind of thing. Very simply, I'll say to the kid, like, whatever you got boosting 4K, what happens if you go from 2 dB to 10 dB? What happens? Well, I don't know. I've never tried. There's this hesitancy, well, I've heard that that's crazy to go crazy with the knobs. I couldn't disagree more with that. I mean, that's all I did when I was learning was explore the limits of everything.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio.
I'm Brian Murphy, and I strive to produce masters that move your song emotionally, but maintain the spirit of your mix and the intention of the artist. My promise is to give your music its best sonic performance, not simply change it. You work hard on your mix, and I always want to respect that. My goal is to help you realize how great your mix can be, and I'll work hard to make sure it succeeds. I don't just master, I help your mix sound the best it can. Contact me for a free mastering demo at soundporter.com.
I've got 2 words for you that will help you make your best record ever and not lose it: storage and backup. You want fast drives for composing and recording, and reliable drives for backup so you don't lose all your hard work when something goes wrong. That's why I chose OWC Mercury Extreme Pro 6G internal SSDs for my studio computer and Mercury Elite Pro external drives for archiving. Discover the best OWC drive options for your studio at macsales.com/rockstars. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Tony Black, a Grammy-winning music producer, mixer, engineer, and songwriter-musician. He has contributed to recordings totaling more than 50 million units sold or downloaded. He won a Grammy Award for his contribution to the album The Diary of Alicia Keys for Best R&B Album, and he also mixed and recorded Ride or Die on the Grammy-winning album Jay-Z Hard Knock Life Volume 2. Tony spent many years in New York City at legendary studios such as The Power Station, The Hit Factory, Quad, and Electric Lady, and he became part of the 90s hip-hop scene that would go on to make music history, working with artists such as Notorious BIG, Jay-Z, Q-Tip, Lil Kim, P. Diddy, Puffy, Cameron, Tang Clan, Michael Jackson, and many, many others. He clocked in more than 4,000 sessions in the 90s alone. These sessions led to a 6-year working relationship with Alicia Keys, and he recorded and mixed all of the Diary of Alicia Keys. He continues mixing, recording, and producing new music today for label artists, indie artists, and for his own project, Slow Down the Quick, based in New York City and working anywhere in the world with his mobile project studio. I want to give a big thanks to Josh Harris, also a guest on the podcast previously, for making our introduction. So please welcome Tony Black to Recording Studio Rockstars. Tony, are you ready to rock, my friend?
I am ready to rock.
All right, great to have you here on the show, man. So I think you said you're joining us sort of from St. Louis this year. Of course, this podcast will come out later than we record it, but in 2020, you're spending some time in St. Louis at Carl's or something like that?
Yeah, I came out to St. Louis in early June of 2020. Due to the pandemic, New York City had basically shut down in March. So I was working remote out at some family's place, my family's place in New Jersey for a couple of months. And then Carl invited me to come out to St. Louis because he had some extra space in the house, and he has a studio around the corner from his house that I could use if I needed to do any extensive recording or bands or anything like that.
That's very cool. And Rockstars, we're talking about Carl Nappa, who's also been a previous guest on the show.
Yeah, so 1 month led to the next. Obviously there was this crazy progression of shutdowns and lockdowns and all kinds of things like that. And New York City still hasn't gotten back on its feet. And now we're in November while we're recording this, and it's still not functioning as far as, for my intents and purposes.
Yeah. Well, so we can get into that more because, of course, we love hearing stories about portable studio setups and anything that makes us feel like our home studio setup is more capable than we thought it was. But give us a little bit of history on your background, Tony. You have done so much stuff. I mean, like 4,000 sessions. I feel guilty even asking you to remember any of those.
Yeah.
Just because that's so much stuff.
Well, it's crazy that you don't know what's happening when it's happening. I think probably many people have said that. But then you look back and you say, wait a minute, from 93 to 2003, just 10 years. You do 325 sessions a year because you're basically working every day, luckily, and maybe taking a weekend off or Sunday off, and you realize, wait a minute, like how did I do 4,000 or 5,000 of these sessions, and those sessions included multiple songs many times. So where did the 8,000 or 9,000 songs go? I have no idea. There's a bunch of them that are out, and there's probably, I don't know, probably 75% of the songs you work on during the course of your career may never even see the light of day.
Yeah.
I think that's common.
They're going to a shelf somewhere.
They go into a shelf, hopefully on a shelf, or they're just in some digital form, or they just evaporate. They just go by the wayside, or somebody redoes them or whatever.
Left in the back of a taxi cab in New York somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, now who knows? They're on an old laptop in a landfill, right?
Wow. Well, what are some thoughts that you have about the process of actually keeping track of all that stuff in terms of what was released? I mean, did you find it was a huge challenge to just sort of collate your discography during that time? Has that changed now in the present, or was it easier then or easier now?
Yeah, I don't know. Back then I think it was somewhat easier because things physically came out, meaning a CD or not really vinyl, but everything was based around the CD. Let's face it, from like 1990 to 2005 or 4.
Yeah.
So you could always either go to the store and buy the record you worked on that just came out, buy the CD, and have some sort of physical representation of it, where you opened it up and looked at the credits and said, oh, okay, I got my credit. Half the time you didn't. And then that's a whole nother concept. Right. But I wish I would have kept a more professional diary of every song, because it would be interesting. You do forget them.
Right. Of course, the Diary of Tony Black.
Yeah. I wish I would, but and it would be fascinating, sort of, to look back and say, like, oh yeah, we did this song. But there was a lot of it there was no time for that. I mean, if you were to sit there and be like, oh, let me write this down, that I just did these 3 tunes today, or this, I worked with, for instance, recorded some harmonica player that I had never heard of, and this was fascinating, and I should make a note of this. Where are you going to do that? When you're in the midst of it, it just feels like it's always going to happen, which is certainly not true. But you always feel as though like it's just going to continue. So why bother writing it down or keeping track of it? It wasn't easy. I mean, I can literally go through certain things and see an artist's name and go like, oh yeah, you know what? I worked with them on that album, and I'll write it down and add it to my discography. There's fortunately with having a website since like 97, which I was kind of an early adopter to that. I started doing that with a discography thing online. And so it's been a little easier for me to add on to the little database here and there.
Well, and the methods for doing something like that have changed so much over the years. I mean, originally it might have been you always having a notebook somewhere nearby, and then it becomes, I guess, a website, and these days it's sort of like, what kind of Google Doc can you keep track of?
Yeah, I mean, I'm using a new thing now called Rocketbook, where you can write stuff down and scan it with your phone immediately with the app, and then it emails it to you and sends it to a Google Doc. And I mean, those things would have been tremendous back in any time, just to keep notes on even a recording process or a production idea. Nowadays.
Yeah, and of course, like, just the ability to have iPhone photos and things like that. That's so
Yes, that's
fantastic.
huge. I remember guys taking pictures with
Polaroids?
some sort of Polaroids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was our iPhone back in the day, right?
Yeah, and that was clever and all that kind of stuff. But who knew? Who knew? Yeah,
Well,
those Polaroids would be a cool collection to find wherever they are.
in fact, I just had to find photos of a session. It wasn't that long ago. It was only back in, I guess it was 2019. But just to be able to go back in time through a list, just a endless stream of photos to a date, and then go like, I think I went to the calendar, saw the session date, then go back in time to the photos. You find the photos, you're like, wow, here are all the photos from that session. I mean, that would have been so hard to do before.
Yeah, impossible.
Well, very cool. So tell us a little bit about where you started. I mean, like, give us the brief introduction. How'd you get interested in music in the first place?
Well, I started playing guitar in my teens, and quickly found something that was, that I gravitated to. And
where were you? Was this East Coast
I was in New
or
Jersey.
something?
Yeah, I was in New Jersey. And what happened was, during the course of that, like somewhere early on, like in my late teens, I guess, 18 or something like that, I got a job at a music store, which was like a mom and pop shop that had instruments and lessons and gear and all that, which I loved it there. And it was probably like 83, something like that, 82. So this was when Van Halen and rock, and then really there was just a huge boom in the 80s of pop music from Prince and George Michael and Springsteen and all that. But what happened was, I became sort of like running the store, and we were slowly getting into carrying cooler gear or whatever. And we got 4-track machines and things like that. And what I would do is, at 9 o'clock at night, I would lock the door, close the store and lock the door, and just have at it with all the gear, setting up a 4-track machine, tape, cassette 4-track recorder, and some new little really crappy old drum machine that had just come out that no one knew anything about, and everyone was frowning upon because it was a drummer in a box. But I just loved the stuff, and started trying to learn how to do any kind of possible way to make records or recordings, from learning how to print something called like an FSK tone on a track, and syncing a drum machine with that. There was no MIDI, like all kinds of weird stuff that just, I mean, countless hours. And then I would work till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and then clean up and set the store back up so that it looked like it was ready to open at 10 a.m., and then leave and come back later on in the afternoon when it was my turn to work, and do the same thing over and over again.
And this was high school years, or this was post high school?
It was just out of high school. Yeah.
Wow, what a great time chapter for being able to do something like that too.
Yeah, but it started me down the path of the lonely solo studio life.
Right.
I was there alone in a strip mall that was closed.
That's like the perfect setting for one of those, Day of the Dead movies too.
Yeah. You'd be like, and you're talking about in the 80s or whatever, there was no like, hey, I'll call Uber and get a delivery of food or something. It was over. Like everybody was done at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock.
Wow.
But that's what got my mentality or mindset in the comfort of being in a studio, or being alone and being with gear, and and it's sort of like feeling like you're communicating with the outside world via music.
What do you remember as your first opportunity where you sort of got a foot in the door of a real studio?
Um, a friend of mine that worked at the store was older, and his band was making a demo, and they, as far as what I'd heard, was told it was, yeah, we're making a demo, and we're working with this producer guy up in North Jersey. And my friend asked me, he was like, do you want to come? And I was like, yeah, sure. So I show up, and I go with him to this house in Alpine, New Jersey, and the guy had built a 24-track studio in his house. He had a lot of money. I don't know where from, but um, I remember to this day, the guy had like a crazy pyramid in the control room that you would go under to like feel the energy, and I just got in love with the whole bunker mentality of being in the studio, not being aware of the weather or the time, and drinking gallons of coffee and going at it, trying to make some kind of music thing happen.
No, I love it. So now, interesting that at that age, the first thing you reference is coffee. Were
Yeah.
you, I mean, were you partying just like other kids as well? Or was that sort of, did you go counter to that? And do you have anything to say about that as far as starting
Yeah,
out?
I was counter to that. I never took part in certainly never any hard drugs, and even my recreational thing was like super duper minimal. I uh, I think I was lucky in the sense to a certain degree that as in the 80s were a little nuts for that whole coke and booze thing in the
Right. Plus the
studio.
pyramid.
The pyramid, yeah, all that trippy shit. But it was I felt like I had been influenced to not get involved in that kind of stuff early.
Mhm.
And weird influences, like, hearing Ted Nugent one day say like, I don't get high or drunk because I have to have my wits about me. Um, Influenced me, when I was 14 years old, because
What
I
about,
was a
were you a Frank Zappa fan at all?
no,
Okay.
no.
I feel
I,
like that would have been one of his messages too.
yeah, I mean, there were a few guys that were into that message of like, no, you got to keep your wits about you when you're working or when you're making music. And then there were obviously the other crew that was just complete. I think every generation sort of goes counter to to who's just before them.
Hmm.
So like, even though Van Halen, as it turned out, was a massive party band, they were not like the stare at the ground, loaded out on LSD and just kind of like zombied out. So there was
Hmm.
there was a the next round was of musicians seemed to be a little bit more into energy, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, I mean, you had like David Lee Roth doing flying
Yeah,
full body kicks through the air.
yeah. So, I mean, I think part of it's luck because I've seen a lot of bad things with regards to people who just got caught up in too much excess of booze or whatever, and in the studio, and I also saw the repercussions as I was coming into the New York scene, that the crowd that was sort of leaving engineer wise and producer wise, that had been through the maniacal 24-hour sessions fueled by coke and booze, they were just shot. And they were of a different mindset, which I didn't like. I didn't care for that particular crowd.
So you spent all this time in New York and you worked at a lot of amazing studios. And I think, reading some of your descriptions of doing, I think you're talking about like the Ghostface Killers and Wu-Tang Clan sessions, just
Mhm.
that idea of doing a hip hop session where there's a posse of people, like there's a ton of people in the studio. And I've heard other people describe a session in New York like that, where he just said like the contact high of even being in the studio was something to just kind of keep your wits
Yeah.
about you. Do you feel like having that other approach, like you weren't there to drink or do drugs, but you were there to just focus on the music, that may have actually really helped you and your ability to interact with a music scene that may have, I don't know, brought a lot of partying to the studio. And correct me if I'm stereotyping too, because I'm just sort of exploring this.
No, I think I don't think there's. I think musicians are musicians. I don't know if there's any way to stereotype. I think I know what you're saying by stereotyping, but the mentality I always had was, first of all, engineering is particularly at that time, I think, for me at least, was a difficult chore in that I didn't know a lot of the stuff. I didn't know a lot of. I didn't have a ton of experience, and I was in there very early on my experience side of things. So I had to really be focused and really be on my game. And I didn't feel as though, first of all, that the party was something that I was meant to be part of. That especially the guys that I had noticed or been around as engineers and producers, they were more of like the ringleaders, or like, the guys who were keeping things organized, and it was the artists and their friends who were bouncing off the walls.
Right.
And I also really early got a sense that they were counting on you to be the one to make sure everything was cool, not, stuff wasn't getting erased, and things weren't being recorded stupidly because you were high also. Was there contact high? I'm sure. I don't think there's any doubt about that, but
you're the designated driver.
Yeah. You're the last one awake and everyone's passed out. That was, but I don't think that was any different than the 70s or the 80s,
Yeah. I always felt that too. I mean, I guess I just, once I wanted to do this professionally, I just felt like I had a job to do, and it was easier for me to stay focused on it if I wasn't messing around. I remember the first time I tried to get high with the band, and I took a look at like a Medusa's nest of cables in the patch bay, and I just had this holy shit moment. I can't do that,
Yeah. I mean, if something goes wrong, you're going to get the blame. If you're the guy who's supposed to be keeping control of the tracks and the recording process and the phase and all those different kind of crazy technical concepts, I mean, they're not going to blame the singer who was high and drunk.
Right.
You're going to get the call saying, what are you going to do about this? Now, there are guys that pulled it off. I mean, there's no question. There are guys that pulled it off, and I think I actually used it as a marketing tool, but it just wasn't my thing.
Yeah. Do you want to know how I get a consistent sound quality mixing hundreds of episodes of Recording Studio Rockstars? Well, I've been cheating all along by using Isotope RX and Ozone on every single episode. Right now, you are hearing RX declick, declip, DS, deplosive, voice denoise, Ozone multiband compression, EQ, and limiting on my voice. If you want great consistent mixes too, go to isotope.com/rockstars and use the code ROCK10 to get an additional 10% off. The secret to great sounding bass in your mix is to start with a great recording. If you've got an awesome part, player, and instrument, then all you need next is to plug that into the BBDI passive direct box from Spectra 1964 through the C610 comp limiter, and you've got an incredible bass tone that goes all the way down. The BBDI is the best sounding bass DI I have ever used. It'll move your pant leg. No hype, no color, just pure tone at Spectra1964.com. Well, all right. So you get into like, what was your entrance into the studios, like the Power Station and the Hit Factory, Quad, Electric Lady?
I had a couple little brushes with it because I became sort of known as a kid that knew toys, like new 4-tracks and 8-tracks and drum machines. One day, a friend of mine who was actually playing drums with the guitar player from Joan Jett and the Blackhearts said, hey, would you come to the studio with me? Because Ricky wants to do some writing with a drum machine, and you know how to program a drum machine. So I brought some crazy old drum machine, which was new at the time, was like a Korg DDD1 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to Unique Studios, and this had to be like 85 or 6 maybe, when it was a grimy rock studio at that point. But I do remember seeing like a Queen Latifah thing on the wall and saying like, who the hell's Queen Latifah? You know, she had like the crazy hairstyle and all that kind of stuff, and she was early hip hop. But I did like drum programming for a writing session, and then another time my friend of the same band from the music store, they got tied in with Tony Bon Jovi somehow, and they got to do a vocal session at the the Power Station. And then this was the time of like gang vocals and stuff like that. So he's like, "Hey, why don't you come with me to the Power Station and sing background vocals?" So I got to sing. I think my first recording of myself even was singing background vocals in the A room at Power Station in the famous arched ceiling deal. I had no idea. There was a big deal.
Did you still have aspirations to be a musician yourself at this point?
Yeah. It was all about being in a band and playing guitar and being a rock star.
Mm-hmm. And can you hit the high note?
I can hit that high note, right? It's thanks to like Pearl Jam and stuff like that, I wound up not going fully into rock star world. Everything changed so drastically when Alive came out and all that. You mean
because vocals all of a sudden became all about the baritone?
Yeah, and you had to get rid of a whole new wardrobe, flannel shirt and cut off shorts, right?
That's great, man. Well, so it's really cool to hear the story of like, you go into the studio interested in the rock sort of transition from the 70s into the 80s, Van Halen and all the, the emergence of I guess, I don't know, was New York sort of the emergence of the hair band scene too, or was that really strictly LA through the 80s?
That was the only thing going on in New York on a rock thing was like sort of this, New York had a reputation where no rock bands ever made it out of New York.
Right.
For whatever reason, they got famous there in town and they could never break through, but they were really happy being famous there.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of happens even today. But New York was definitely LA, was, if you wanted to make it in the rock, hair rock thing, LA was the place to go for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it helps when the population's so huge in New York that you really can sustain a career there, I'm sure.
Yeah, you could be real famous like within 3 or 4 blocks and be super cool in the Lower East Side, and no one else in the country knows about you.
What was one of the first hip hop sessions you got to do?
I was thinking about that the other day. Somebody asked me that, and it could be Mobb Deep. It could be one of the first ones that I did when I was officially engineering. When I first got to, I don't know if are we skipping anything now? We're pretty much it. When I first got into the studio game in New York, a friend of mine had it was another coincidence of being known as a guy who was doing home studio recording, which was definitely my thing. I had a setup in my parents' house for a while. I had it at my friend's place. Another studio in Jersey. I had a little production room where I had a DA88 8-track digital recorder, and so I became known as a guy who was doing that stuff and programming drums. And granted, in a very rock white environment, so no one was using drum machines.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really drawn to Prince and some of the early R&B kind of like New Jack Swing stuff and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that, for whatever reason, I just love drum machines. So this one guy that I was helping out with his home studio was in the band Skid Row, which was another hard rock band from the 80s. He asked me to come over to his house one day to help him set up his ADAT studio because he was getting into having a home studio. And while we were doing that, we kind of hit it off. And then he was going to an AES show that week with a friend of his who he said worked at the Hit Factory. And he said, do you want to go to the AES show? I didn't even know what it was. And I said, yeah, I'll go. So I hop in the car with him one day and we pick up this guy, Mike Thompson, who really cut me a huge break. So we go to this AES show and I'm like, wow, this is cool. It's a trade show for recording gear, I guess, right? This is what you would call it. And we walk around for the day and we kind of wrap up the day a little bit and we're riding home and Mike says, Tony, like, what are you doing? You're set up in this studio in Jersey and talking about that. He's like, you want to work at the Hit Factory? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, is it cool? And he said, I'll talk to Troy, who was one of the owner's son, and I'll set something up or whatever. So somewhere along the line, he called me up and he said, yeah, you can go Monday morning and meet Troy. I said, all right. So I drive into the city, park. I don't know anything about it. I honestly didn't know anything about it. And at the time, Hit Factory had just opened up their super duper fancy studio, which had 6 studios and 6 floors. It was very corporate looking. I show up there and there's a receptionist and all that. And she said, yeah, you can go upstairs to see Troy. It was very tightly run, security guards, the whole bit. And I go upstairs. I get called into Troy's office. He's a young guy. He's like, oh yeah, Mike says you're cool. You want to work? You want to work in the recording studio or whatever? I said, yeah. He's like, do you have a resume? I was like, no. He said,
it's like, what are you doing here?
He's like, so what do you want to do? I said, honestly, I want to work on records that actually come out.
Nice.
I said, I've been doing a lot of stuff in New Jersey with like these owner-operator places and demos and things like that. And like, I'd like to work on the things that actually come out. He goes, do you know how to use an SSL? I was like, not really. He said, a Neve? No. Flying faders? No. Ultimation? No. He's like, well, you're going to have to start as a, just like running around for a little bit and then we'll get you in the room. We'll see about getting you in the rooms and all that stuff. I was like, okay. He goes, well, you could start, tomorrow. Just go over to 237, which was their other building, at 8 o'clock in the morning to see Kim. I show up there not knowing any fucking thing. I mean, like literally, yes, I had seen large format consoles in person once or twice, but never an SSL.
Yeah. And nobody had thought to ask you about drum machines yet, right?
No, they weren't interested. So in the beginning, regardless of what you knew or whatever, they would just make you be like someone who sets up all the building for the day. Like, run around to each room, make sure all the the mic wires are there, the headphones are there, blah, blah, blah. And you're essentially a runner. But like for me, that was fine because I just wanted to see what was going on. But within the first hour or two, I was like, okay, Paul Simon's going down the hallway to go to that room. Joan Jett's over there. Groove Theory's working in another room. And Nile Rodgers is coming in tonight to work with so-and-so. I was like, this is pretty interesting, And then just the mass of staff that was involved. There was receptionists, there were janitors even, there were technicians to set up every room and align tape decks for every session, fix gear, guys who were just in a room fixing gear. Like to me, that was just like mind-bogglingly cool, wow, technicians. on staff. And what I did was I just hovered for a few weeks. And I photocopied every manual that was available and just played sort of like, didn't talk a lot. I just, even just waited for information to come to me so that I didn't look like I didn't know what I was doing, or didn't have a clue. And I would slowly like learn one thing a day. Like, okay, now I know how to turn that on, and I know how to patch in this, and okay, that's how you that's how you can listen to a cassette in the studio. Really simple stuff. Um, and just built up a trust enough, because it really is in that environment, the word gets around on what kind of person you are, I guess. Whether you're attentive and reliable and understand what it's like to be in front of a client, how you carry yourself when you walk in the room, and respectful and all that kind of stuff.
They probably liked that you were quiet and just sort of.
That was definitely an advantage, because the louder you were and the more in your face you were, the quicker you got fired. And people got fired there literally by the day. It was just an amazing turnover. And I really adopted the philosophy of like out of sight, out of mind. And I mean, to that end, I didn't meet Eddie for the first year that I worked there, and he was the owner of the studio. I just avoided that whole thing, because I learned that if you go and hung around management, they would decide much faster if they were sick of you or not.
Right.
And so I was like, man, this couple of guys would be like, yeah, I'm going over there to hang out with Troy, and I'm going to hang out with this one and hang out. I'm like, I don't know if that's a good idea, Bomb, they get fired,
Yeah. Plus, what are you going to learn about making records if you're in the office?
I think they thought it was a little bit about the schmooze thing, just the trying to work their way up the charm ladder, so to speak, right?
Sometimes you just need a mic that will stand out in a mix. That's when you need the new BB29 Signature Series from Jay-Z Microphones. The unique single diaphragm golden drop capsule gives the BB29 airy highs and smooth mid-range to help your tracks stand at the front of your mix. Jay-Z's handcrafted, fully discreet microphones come with a 5-year warranty and free shipping to the US. You're hearing my voice on the BB29 right now. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the BB29 at jzmic.com. Well, that's interesting, man. That's really cool. And then, I know one of the things that you had mentioned to me is this idea, if you can't, then learn from others. And I feel like, maybe if you want to expand on that topic a little bit relative to being in a studio like the Hit Factory early on, or even to today, and learning how to do stuff through resources like YouTube and using the internet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, truthfully, like, I didn't know anything when I went in there. I didn't know really. I couldn't even describe to you what a mic pre was. If I really got down to the brass tacks. So I just connected with people that I could really understand. It didn't take me long to figure out, like, wait a minute, this guy knows a lot of stuff. This technician who sets up a room every morning, who like aligns the 24-track machine, who fixes the faders, who checks out the computer. He knows a lot of stuff. So I would kind of follow that guy around in the morning, and his name was Kim Stallings. He's kind of a legendary technician in the New York studio life. And the guy helped me tremendously. I mean, if I asked him, simple stuff like, hey, Kim, how do you turn on the automation for this mode or whatever? He'd be like, oh, it's simple. It's just like, and you don't have to worry about that. He would explain, other things. And he always had anecdotes or stories from other engineers, how this guy works or how that guy works. So, and then there were other assistant engineers that I learned to trust, and also learned that they were knowledgeable and also willing to help. And so you would pick up the phone if you were stuck on something and call that guy up and say, hey, this client wants to record 3 microphones at a time on 3 different 24-track machines. Like, how do I do that? And it'd be a quick answer, and then you knew it. And then you would pass on information to younger guys or to newer guys that you thought were cool and who deserved to learn, so to speak. There was definitely some weeding out of guys on a continual basis.
It's cool that you were willing to learn from the tech, and I'm thinking about that topic and trying to remember if there was much of a distinction back then or now about like, oh, I'm not interested in the tech stuff. I just want to do this over here. That I'm sure that existed on some level, but
Yeah.
I do hear people, young people, interns and stuff who come in and they say, oh, I really want to be a mixer. And to me, it's a funny thing to hear that these days, because it's like, oh, I really want to start at the end of this long journey or something like that,
Yeah. It's, I think you can learn from unlikely sources more than you can learn from the guys you think are obvious. Like, I think I definitely learned more from technicians and musicians about recording than I did from other engineers. And that continues. For one, you're never really, unless I only assisted for a short amount of time. I went from that runner thing to be an assistant, and I uh, I I worked crazy hard for sure, but also I got lucky. I got like pulled into a couple of things that all of a sudden I was an engineer. Um, and I was more comfortable, honestly, as an engineer than I was as an assistant engineer, because actually the assistant seems to actually have to know more than the engineer,
Right.
right? Especially back then. The assistant used to be the guy that like guided the engineer and the producer through the studio. They were the conduit to like get everything to happen, and a lot of times the engineer was kind of like, hey, hook up a microphone and a pre and a compressor and patch it into that, and let me know when it's ready.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an easy lifestyle when you only have to hit record, maybe adjust the level. And there were some guys that didn't even hit record. They would have a tape op. So the assistant thing was a harder job. But on the other side, getting to the other part was like, you don't work with, unless you're assisting engineers, you're never around them because you're just in your own session and you have an assistant. So if you have a good assistant, occasionally you would have, found out something from them. I definitely used to pick the brains of an assistant early on, like, hey, what were they using on such and such? Or, oh yeah, this, that, and the other thing, and definitely other engineers used that info to their advantage, finding out, because there were no blogs and YouTubes and Googles and all that kind of stuff. It was literally word of mouth.
Yeah, and there was that whole community scene and aspect of a studio like the Hit Factory back then, which I guess today we have our versions of that through the internet, which can be pretty great. And I know some people here in Nashville talk about wanting to bring that back, and occasionally you have a place like Blackbird Studios where you have the community aspect again, just because there's so many people working in one location. But that is an awesome thing. I mean, it's the thing I loved about going to recording school initially, was just being surrounded by people who wanted to talk about recording and having a podcast.
Yeah. I mean, God bless you. You're like, you're still talking the gear. I mean, I get caught up in talking the whole thing too, for sure. But to do it on a weekly basis is pretty good for you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for joining us for this too. Well, so, it's interesting. You talk about the assistant thing and the engineering thing. Of course, the assistant, as you say, sort of has to know how to do everything and anything in the studio for anybody that might need anything,
Yeah.
Whereas when you're engineering, when you get to that point, if you're producing a record and you're cutting vocals on it, then they just want you to know how to cut that vocal really well. But there is also that thing where you accumulate knowledge over time so that you're ready for any problem even though you only have to focus on one thing at a time as an engineer,
Mhm.
you just have that accumulation of knowledge. When any issue comes along, you know how to solve it because you've done it before.
Yeah, yeah. I think I definitely agree with I felt more as the lead engineer guy. I felt more of the guy who as being the person who was running the whole ship, um, and guiding the entire project along for the artist. Um, and to a certain extent, the job was easier. Like I said, than the assistant who would have to be there an hour or two early and an hour or two after the session was done.
Mhm.
Uh, and to that end, I always treated my assistant as like part of the team. I I did notice that the engineering generation prior to mine, say like the '80s rock guys and creeping into the '90s, they were very. I'm generalizing, but I'm not far off. They were a very they were dictators, like, and very brutal to the assistant engineers. They treated them like, this was life or death, and they need to be without any flaws, or they're going to get screamed at, yelled at, stuff thrown at them, the whole bit.
Yeah.
And I always looked at that as just completely absurd and outrageous that somebody could think that because they were the engineer that they could treat the assistant like garbage and scream at him and say, you blew the patch, and what the F is wrong with you? I didn't want that microphone, and all this. Like, but I guess it's sort of like a conditional thing. It's what you're used to. I mean, I know guys that I would actually visit and see them yelling at their assistants, and I'd be like, you really talk to your assistants that way? Oh yeah, that's the way I got talked to.
I bring that up on the podcast too, because it is a throwback attitude of the studio that was intriguing to me as a student. You hear it and it's like, whoa, I heard that,
Yeah.
do you hear the story about so-and-so and he messed up a thing and he was kicked out of the studio and, fired from the session or whatever. And it sounds, I don't know, it just sounds sensational. So
Oh no,
it intrigues you as a student, but
it was definitely real.
But then you always wondered, was it really necessary? Is there a point to it?
It was definitely not necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it was fueled by coke and booze and just, I think, just a like, well, that's what everybody else does kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you ever feel like the flip side to that is that creating importance around these things so that whoever's assisting, whoever's starting out gets a real sense of, wow, this little thing I was asked to do is actually really important because there's a domino effect. If it doesn't go well and the other thing doesn't go well, and then all of a sudden we didn't get the take with the band kind of thing.
Yeah. It's weird because like when you're never on anybody else's session, you don't know how the assistants treated or how that kind of works. But I really never had a lot of problems with assistants, as far as them understanding that I was like dead serious about what we were doing, and that it was important, but I wasn't out of hand trying to scare the shit out of them,
Right.
So I think they took it in that context of like, okay, I'll joke around when it's time to joke around, and I'll goof around when it's time to goof around. But when it's time to really get down, there's no getting around it. It's time to get down and really get serious about the work, or be serious about the work. And I think it carried more weight when on the occasion I would have to get into it with an assistant. They really understood that, like, wow, if he's really coming at me about something, I must have really effed up, and they got the point. I think if you're like a broken record screaming all the time, and I knew assistants that worked with engineers who were sort of tyrants, they tuned them out eventually.
Right.
They'd be like, oh, that's just him doing his thing, you know.
Sounds like good relationship advice.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all relationships, right? I mean, geez.
Well, you know, you make a good point. Just the way that you know, an assistant sees you take your own work seriously, that's the inspiration right there. When they see, you know, an engineer, producer really seriously addressing the music in the studio as if it really does matter, that's going to make an impression.
Yeah. I remember clearly, like, I'd been working with one artist for quite a long time. I had a tendency to like go on runs with artists or producers and work with them for 2 years here, 3 years there, and 5 years here. And I was working with one artist and for quite a while, and she had never seen me lose it on an assistant. And it wasn't like a crazy lose it. I was like, you know, was in the booth just with him, and I don't remember the exact issue with the microphone, but there was some kind of problem, and I kind of let him have it. And I came back in the room, and even the artist was like, "Oh, I've never seen that before." You know, like, you must be really upset about this. So like, yeah. And then there was some other crazy part of it was like they had heard me drop a few choice words, and they were like, you know, the girl that was sitting there, she's like a reborn Christian and this and that. I'm like, oh my God. You know, like the one time that I went off, there was someone who was like, you know, horrified by it. Jeez, you know.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I have to wonder if sessions in Nashville and New York were different by nature in LA, you know, just the way that people culturally maybe interact.
When I went to LA for occasions, there was definitely a different mentality. It was way more relaxed, way more chill. And then even my Nashville stuff, I did a few months here and there in the early 2000s in Nashville. And yeah, I mean, I think as far as high strung goes, and on the edge of your seat stuff, New York clearly has that down, or had it down in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as my brother described New York, I maybe it was a guitar player in his band, said when they grew up, they drove a station wagon around. So it's like the way traffic is in each city, that probably applies to the way a session is. They would drive around in the family station wagon, and they always kept a hockey stick in the back to just bust it out in any kind of traffic, you know, confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and Nashville's version of traffic in the studio is, you know, in Nashville, nobody uses their turn signal. It's like, come on, man.
Is that right?
Yeah. So
I never
stuff like that. So, well, groovy. A gold bar should be kept safe in a vault because it's valuable, but it could be replaced if it was ever lost. One of your songs or recordings, on the other hand, is worth more than gold because it's one of a kind. It's you, and if it was ever lost, it could never be replaced. So wouldn't you feel better knowing your music was safe? This is why I like to have a dedicated system drive, audio work drive, virtual instrument storage drive, cloud storage, and an extra large backup drive in my studio computer. And when I'm finished with the project, I move it onto a dedicated pair of external drives for archiving. Thanks to OWC, I can count on my drives being super fast, reliable, and secure so that I can work quickly and sleep soundly at night knowing my music is safe. I want your music to be safe too. Discover the best options for storage and backup for your studio from OWC at macsales.com/rockstars. Have you ever wished you could remove the click-track bleed from a singer's vocal mic, the sound of shuffling feet from a full choir, or clicking noises from the valves of an otherwise brilliant trumpet solo? These are just some of the incredible things I've been able to clean up, edit, or remove from a recording using the magic of iZotope RX. Great for mixing with a collection of plugins for your DAW to manage plosives, clicks, S's, noise, buzz, reverb, breaths, and even guitar fret squeaks with the set it and forget it simplicity that lets you you focus on your creativity in the studio while you let iZotope handle the audio challenges. If you've ever wanted to truly feel like a magician in the studio, then iZotope RX is your magic wand. Go to iZotope.com/rockstars in the show notes and use the code ROCK10 to get an additional 10% off your first purchase. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Tony Black, joining us to talk about making records in New York, doing hip-hop records in the 90s, and producing music with your mobile and portable studio these days as well. Tony, you ready to kick the second half of the show?
Absolutely. Ready to rock again.
So one of the records that you did was working with Alicia Keys, the Diary of Alicia Keys.
Right.
And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that experience and a little bit, I think you spent quite some time working on that. Was there anything about the beginning of that and the process, or even the ending of that process that you want to share?
Sure. I'd come to work with Alicia somewhere in the year in 2000. Her first record was just coming out or had just come out. And it wasn't yet a hit. She was like basically an unknown. And the record label called me and asked me to do a vocal session with her, record vocals with her, because she wanted to do a bunch of layering a la Destiny's Child, Beyonce's first group. And the label person knew that I had a lot of experience doing multi-track, multi-layered vocals, like crazy stacks of harmonies and vocal tracks, because I'd worked with a lot of R&B and hip hop stuff that was super duper stacks. Mariah Carey, not so much, but like Jodeci and things like that. So apparently Alicia had never done a lot of vocal stacking. So next thing you know, I'm in the studio with her at Quad in New York, and her production partner, Carrie, at the time. And we just tracked a bunch of vocals. They were curious as to how to do it, what everyone else, wanting to know what everyone else did. And we probably recorded like some crazy amount of backgrounds, like 80 tracks of background vocals for a chorus and B section.
What is, if there's anything about how you would describe, what did you do back then? We'd love to hear that too.
We typically did 4 tracks of each note, which I don't know if that's even changed all that much now, but Alicia, because she was kind of new to the whole thing, when I told her we typically do 4 tracks of each note, she's like, oh, okay. Then like, maybe I want to do 6. And I was like, well, you don't really need to do 6, but I mean, if you want to do 6, we'll do 6. And so we did. So, if you wind up with 4 or 5 notes on a section, and then you have 6 tracks of each, I mean, you have 30 tracks pretty quickly.
And we're on tape at this point. So you're talking about multiple sheet machines and slave reels and all that stuff?
In 2000, that's a good question. I think I was using Pro Tools. I was an early guy on Pro Tools, like super duper early.
Yeah.
I had an Audio Media 3 card, and I was able to do vocals. Initially, it was like, well, I can get away with doing background vocals, or I can use it for a couple extra tracks with this guy. I think he only had 8 tracks back then. But I think there was something to the extent where if we were using tape, I was recording the 6 tracks, and maybe bouncing them into Pro Tools, and then recording another 6. And when I would run out of the space, because you would have you'd only really have 20 tracks to work with, because you'd have a 2-track stereo mix, and then you'd have time code and a blank track, so you were down to 20. So we were right in the transition mode when I was doing that. So anyway, we hit it off somehow, and I didn't even know that we hit it off. It was just a typical session to me. I thought she was talented and nice, and Kerry was a cool guy, and he wound up asking me a bunch of questions over the course of the week about putting together a home studio. It was like they were talking about putting like some gear in their basement of their house that they had as a rental to like do tracks. And I would just give him advice here and there on maybe what mic to get and Pro Tools, because Pro Tools was, they were definitely talking about buying Pro Tools. So it was sort of happening. We had 888s, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, then the next thing you know, she blows up. Fallen becomes like this humongous hit. And then I started getting calls from the label saying, Alicia's going in the studio. She wants to do it with you. And from then on, I just became her go-to engineer. One of those cases of like, wow, I'm glad that went well the first time, because like, as it turns out, this turned into a great relationship and a great artist to be working with. I didn't know. I didn't have a sense of like, oh, I'm working with something that's magic right now, in the very beginning. So as things rolled along, then it got to somewhere in 2002-ish, where the talk started to be to do the next record, to follow up songs in A minor, which Puffy referred to as songs in a minor, on TV actually. But and one day we went to a studio in NoHo in New York, which is like north of Houston.
Yeah.
And supposedly just to like track a little bit and see if we liked a studio called Campo, which no one really used. It had an SSL and a live room and a couple of booths. So we went down there and we set up for a full band and recorded the whole day. The label called me Alicia was asking me throughout the day, like, what do you think of this place? What do you think of could you work here? She was very open to opinion and what you thought of your professional advice on different things. And I said, yeah, I think this is a pretty cool place. I think it's workable. I didn't know I wouldn't leave there for the next 11 months, basically every day,
Wow.
because I basically find out the next day or two, yeah, you're gonna start the record, and we're locking out the entire building, and enjoy Campo. I think we probably thought it was only going to be 4 or 5 months, but it turns into, of course, 11.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the recording of Alicia Keys' Diary of Alicia Keys album, where I was there every day, usually 6 days a week. We tended to take Sundays off, and it would be 11 or 12 in the morning start and end at 3 or 4 in the morning, and then sort of get some sleep, 5 or 6 hours, and come back.
Yeah. And Sunday was nothing but laundry and finally sleep a little longer.
I don't even remember what they would have been. Yeah, they it's funny. You don't really pay attention to much when you're in that kind of a grind, and you certainly not even thinking about your exact clothing, and you keep everything simple. I kept it so simple that I was so tired of looking through like menu books that a month into the session, I literally wrote down a list of my favorite 10 meals and put a number next to them from the 10 local places. And to my assistant, I would just be like, he was a Japanese kid named Shu. So I would just say, Shu, get me a number 2. It was just easier for him, because you just want to work and you don't have time for like, hey, let me pick out 6 rolls of sushi that I want, and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, I was equated going into the studio like that, like being in a deep sea, submarine mission. You just sort of lock the hatch, go underwater, and you just don't come up until it's all over. You just
Yeah, we
have
went
no
through a lot of
idea of
stuff
what
there.
about any, the
We went
time.
through a New York City blackout. We were in the studio for that.
Oh yeah.
And that like multiplies the submarine effect. Now you're in a place with no power and you're all stuck there for a few days. Um, but it was a fascinating time in that um, it was a tremendous meeting of people who were basically very on top of their game at that point. I mean, I could honestly feel like I was on top of my game. I felt like Alicia was unbelievably on top of her game. Um, and then she brought in everybody she brought in was kind of like hip and A-list. And honestly, like everything we recorded, we kept. There was no like redoing a song or like, wow, that was a disaster. That was the wrong tempo or the wrong key or whatever. It was like everything worked. From let's do a piano right now to let's do a vocal or let's fix that. Let's call up this song and work on that one. Everything worked. It was just beyond easy in some way.
Yeah.
Um, and I just think it was kind of like one of those moments when you have a bunch of quote unquote alphas in the room, uh, and things just go that way when you have people that are really like tuned in, together.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. It's great when you're working with so many great people like that. It's also great when you're going to go in to the studio sort of indefinitely and you're working on something that's going to turn out to be great and be released. I've experienced the opposite where I've gone into the studio, worked indefinitely, and then nobody heard of the record after it was done,
I've done those. I definitely have done projects where like, what, you get that phone call and you're like, they got dropped, like, what do you mean they got dropped? Like, that's a really good album, yeah, or whatever. And it's like, well, it's not coming out.
Yeah.
It's on pause. That used to be a famous line in the, and so they hit pause on that one. That means it's over.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not much fun. I mean, I guess it's better if you're moving on to the next thing and you got enough records going on that it doesn't, it's not too big a dent out of your career, but I'll tell you.
Yeah, because I mean, what do you tell people that you just worked on if the last 4 things didn't even come out?
Yeah.
And it's a year and a half has passed. That's a tough look on a marketing tip.
Yeah, indeed. Well, so what about you mentioned that there was an ending to the chapter of working with Alicia?
Yeah. Well, as you work with someone for a long time, and let's just say 2000 started the relationship, 2001, 2002, 2003, we do the during the early parts of our run, we were doing a lot of productions that she was producing other artists, whether it was like an R&B kid, Mario, or a couple other different things, and remixes of her stuff.
And did working with Alicia also connect you with Christina Aguilera, or is that later on?
Yeah, that was I think that was after we did Diary, it was after we did Diary. We were doing the track Impossible with Christina. And it was like a thing where Christina wanted to write and have Alicia produce her, and I was still doing all of her stuff at that time. So I think we did her vocals at Electric Lady and Hit Factory, and I think we had tracked the actual music at Quad. And then I sent that off, I think, to Dave Pensato. I think he mixed that one.
Oh, wow.
I want to guess. But she was a tremendous singer. I mean, even Alicia acknowledged that, like, wow, is she that loud, Tony? You know what I mean? I was like, yeah, it's like crazy loud.
What have you learned about that you want to share with us about just capturing powerful vocals like that in the studio? I mean, I feel like sometimes our first opportunity we get in front of a powerful singer and we're not used to it, and then we just kind of blow it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I had set things up as I would typically record a what I was assuming would be a strong female singer. I think it was a 67 and a Neve and the DBX 160, which I liked using on Alicia.
67 with the 14 dB pad or with no pad?
No pad.
No pad, all right.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to like sign off and quote myself on that completely, but I don't remember putting a pad in. Maybe I don't think so. But I do know that I had set it for some typical the mic pre had some typical usual gain thing. And Alicia's a pretty loud singer. Very good control, but loud. And I know that as soon as she started, I like had to literally just like shove my chair and slide over to the pre and click it down 2 or 3 clicks to like, minus 20 or something crazy like that instead of minus 35.
Wow.
But and then I kind of had to dance around a little bit with the threshold on the compressor while she was tracking. I mean, she was aware that she was super powerful, so I went in to like adjust the mic for her, and she kind of was like, is it cool where I'm standing or whatever? I'm like, well, you're a little loud here and there, like, a little super duper power. I don't think any singer minds hearing that they have a super duper power voice. Like that's kind of like a good ego stroke for them.
Right.
So I was like, if you could, you could take a scooch back like a 3 or 4 inches when you're really going to be going for it. She's like, oh, okay, cool. And, and I think a lot of new guys, particularly like say if I had an assistant, they were unaware of the fact that you could actually communicate with an artist and explain to them in an easygoing fashion that what you were trying to do is get them to a great performance and to feeling comfortable, as opposed to dictating to them like some technical mumbo jumbo.
Right.
I found that I find that a lot of engineers get a little too technical with the artist and sort of like, well, you shouldn't be doing that to the mic because I have my mic preset exactly where it's supposed to be set.
Right. And I mean, like, I think the error there is giving the artist some impression that they're supposed to start changing the way they perform to accommodate your technology, right?
Yeah. Even to the extent of like someone saying they want to record something, and all of a sudden the engineer wants to lecture them on like how he has to get the phase right on the mics on the piano before they can record.
Right.
And then all of a sudden a half hour goes by and the artist is like, wow, I don't know if I feel like doing piano now.
Yeah. And do you feel like you got a little bit of a advanced sense of that, Tony, just because you had enough experience as the musician on the other end of a mic, or what? Because I mean, I know for me, that's eye-opening in a big way.
Yeah. I wish I could. I don't think I felt it because I was started on the artist side. I really learned that stuff, believe it or not, from the hip hop crowd. They didn't want any part of hearing why something was going to take forever, because they were used to recording early on in a very just super duper crude fashion of a turntable plugged into something and record that, and then screech vocals into something that was somehow recording it, maybe to a boombox even. So they had no patience for let me try 4 different microphones on you until we can do your vocal. And I learned that quickly, that faster is better, and less fancy is better, because you really want to try and catch the moment, as opposed to like making it about some epic high quality recording scenario. So I just found bread and butter things that worked and never strayed from them, whether it be an SM7 microphone or VU87, and a specific pre and a specific compressor, and then just move on. And if we were doing any live instruments, it would literally be the same mic. Like, the guy wants to do acoustic guitar, lower that microphone down and put it in front of him, and let's go.
Same vocal chain?
Yeah, same thing.
Now, do you feel like in that process of moving quickly, well, you said you had your bread and butter mic, so maybe that just worked and didn't have issues with it. But sometimes I wonder, I'll record drums and maybe it is a good drum pass, but then I'm like, God, I just hate the sound of the overheads on the cymbals or whatever. Do you find that you had to just kind of squelch that part of your inner dialogue and just go like, dude, just stop telling it, like, you'll sort that out in the mix later?
Definitely at times. Yeah, for sure. If I did need to go in and change something, I would explain it to either the drummer or the piano player, in that, like, we were having a little trouble with something, and this was going to, like, make it sound better, for, like, artistic reasons, as opposed to, like, I'm nitpicking on something that, like, is personal.
Right.
I think if they thought it was personal, then all of a sudden it's like, well,
is this your record?
Sounded good to me.
They're like, whose record is this?
Yeah, it sounded good to me in the headphones. Like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah. Bill Cheney, the founder of Spectra 1964, kept getting the same question from customers. What DI should they use with the 610 series comp limiters? After trying to recommend various DIs while making excuses for the way they all sounded, he realized that the solution was to create the perfect direct input box himself. Thus, the BBDI Passive Direct Box from Spectra 1964 was born. By using Spectra design concepts and standards, the BBDI provides a low distortion and flat response design that is unequaled by any standard or measure. The absence of harmonic distortion and articulation of signal detail is readily apparent. This is all done with a passive transformer type design that will provide years of trouble-free operation. Simply put, the BBDI is the best sounding bass DI I've ever used. It'll move your pant leg. No hype, no color, just pure tone at Spectra1964.com. If your goal was to climb Mount Everest, you would hire a Sherpa to guide you to the summit. If you wanted to sail around the world, you would hire a seasoned sea captain for a safe voyage. And if you wanted to try skydiving, you wouldn't just jump out of an airplane without being strapped to an expert, right? So why would you send off your mix for mastering without knowing that it was ready first? Wouldn't it be great to have a professional mastering engineer with a trained ear to guide you through the final stages of mixing? Brian Murphy is your trusted guide at soundporter.com. Home of the iterative mastering process, where you get to interact with a professional mastering engineer who listens to what you want and will give you mix feedback to help you get your mix ready for mastering. Contact Brian now for a free mix review and mastering demo so that you can hear it before you buy it at soundporter.com. So when you're talking about recording vocals, you've done hip hop vocals, you've recorded Alicia, Christina, powerful vocals. Talk to us a little bit about the space for recording the vocals, because I think a lot of us are used to, you just got a room that is not your control room, and you put the voice in there, and then you might be scratching your head. I don't know, does the room sound good for voice? What did you learn about the right space to record voice, whether it's this is what a great vocal room sounds like, or whether it's, dude, quit worrying about the room, it's going to be fine,
I mean, generally, I was spoiled in that I was not recording in makeshift rooms. If you're recording in top-notch studios in New York or LA or Nashville, odds are some room treatment is going to be in there. But then, if there was a situation where it was up in the air, I would just go to a mic, say like an SM7, that would almost more or less take the room out of the equation, because it really doesn't pick up much aside from the vocal super duper close to the diaphragm. And I would have no qualms about doing that instead of using a super sensitive microphone that would pick up a bedroom tonality.
You mean by leaning towards an SM7 instead of a big wide open condenser mic?
Yeah. It's just kind of one of those things where, like, if it doesn't sound good, then just figure it out and move on.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be precious with your choice on, like, well, I knew she was going to sound good on a C12, but not in that room, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, like, how can we get this to sound better? Well, how about an SM7 and throw a blanket around the back of something and put it in front of her so that you can calm something down. Sometimes you have to just make do. We could. I don't know if you want to go back to wrapping up the Alicia run.
Oh yeah, please, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, and this is kind of like on the relationship with working with artists thing, is that I think in the context of any long relationship, and when you get into like 4 or 5 years, you're if there are some people that are into that, and they'll work with one artist for the next 30 years of their life if something like that could happen. I found myself getting a little on the bored side, as far as the next challenge. I mean, could I make another record with her and go about just sort of being in that cocoon of one artist? Yes, I could have technically. I don't think I could have emotionally or mentally. And I think it's good for an artist to change it up and have a different point of view, different energy, depending on where they're at in their career. And I felt like at the end of some part of 2005, I had helped Alicia set up a studio that she bought in Long Island, New York. And I saw that being the beginning of the next stage of her career, in that she was going to have a private studio and also have no limits on anything she wanted to do. And I saw that um, to work with her was going to mean that I was basically going to like live at that place
Right.
and only work with her on, when she wanted to work, and all that goes with being the personal engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a decision to just leave her world,
Mm-hmm.
and it was definitely for no like reasons of, I mean, to a certain extent, there was no reason to leave on a financial tip, for sure. But it was more about a career choice. I mean, I felt like we had done something real cool. Um, and then to go back to the well, I thought was going to be a weird scene for me. And I wanted other challenges. I wanted to like produce. I wanted to have my own room more, so to speak, and just try new things and see where that goes. And that really had nothing to do with the success of the album or getting a Grammy. If anything, some of that was sort of like a letdown of like, oh, really? Like, we got a Grammy and #1 album and this and that. And you do go through a little, or at least I did. You go through a little of the like, oh, now what's next?
Yeah. Yeah.
As opposed to, I just want to do that again. And I could see that where with the pressure with the artist. That's how they go through all that of like, well, how do I start again from scratch?
Well, there's the
So anyway,
expression,
like,
if you're number one, where do you go from there? This
yeah.
if you're
Yeah.
number two, you know where to go, but when you're number one, you can only go back
Yeah.
down again, right?
So that kind of like that became, it was unceremoniously. I just said, "Look, I'm out," and she was cool with it. and really no regrets on that part of it. I basically handed over the keys and just said, who knows what happens next. And it's been fun, actually. I'm glad I did it. Do I would work again with her in a heartbeat to a certain extent. I mean, I think I'd probably have to really hang out, but we've kept in touch here and there through social media or whatever. And yeah, tremendous artist, and very accommodating and very respectful of the engineer side of things. And the proof is in the pudding. She's gone on to like continuing success for another 15 years.
Yeah. What are some of the places that your journey has taken you since you stepped away from that?
I started a production company right after that and produced a few artists. Actually, were Canadian, and a few Canadian artists. We did indie releases. They one band broke up. Another one, I got a deal with Virgin, and then eventually that person got fired, and so that got dropped. I mean, there's been a bunch of things that like freelance I went completely back to like the freelance motif of doing whatever's next.
Yeah.
Whether it be producing or just mixing for people. And truthfully, time goes quickly, and you're like, wait a minute, I've been doing my own production company now for 10 years, and 7 out of Union Square, New York, and I can't even believe that that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Time starts moving faster.
It goes quick.
Yeah.
It goes quick. It's amazing.
So, speaking of the engineer artist symbiotic, unified working relationship, I think of Bruce Swedien and Michael Jackson, and I know that I believe you also work on a Blood on the Dance Floor with those guys?
I started off somewhere in '94. I was like actually brought into the History album as technically an assistant engineer. And Bruce was one of the engineers. Eddie Delana was another engineer who was doing tracking, and we had 2 rooms in the Hit Factory that we were in like a bunker effect. And as it turns out, I mean, it's kind of a crazy story, is that in that room was myself, a guy named Rob Hoffman, who went on to do a bunch of different cool things as an engineer and producer, like developing a couple of different artists. And he actually was involved early on in developing Christina Aguilera. And another guy that was on the session for the 10 or 11 months that we were there was Andrew Sheps.
Oh, wow.
He was the synclavier expert.
Oh, that's right.
And so him and I and Rob were like on this Michael Jackson session as like extra engineers for Eddie and for Bruce. And what happened was the music director liked to work crazy hours. He liked to work, noon to 7 in the morning. And Eddie was kind of tired of it and was exhausted because he had been with them for a year or so before I even came on board. And somehow I became the guy that like would stay at 10 o'clock at night and work with Brad Buxer, the music director, till 7 in the morning. And that's how I became an engineer on the thing. And that kind of stamped me as an engineer. And when I came out of that, that's when hip hop completely embraced me as like, oh my God, this guy engineered on Michael Jackson. We want to work with him.
Yeah.
But the talking about an alpha situation, I mean, we didn't know that. I certainly didn't know that, some of us would go on to, out of the 3 or 4 guys in the room, would go on to like really considerable accomplishments. I mean, Andrew, I didn't even know Andrew was going to be an engineer at the time. He was more of like our guru guy who knew how to do synclavier stuff and knew how to do crazy computer computations. And um, I don't even know that he thought he was going to be a mixer back then. I just had a little video Zoom chat with him like a week or two ago because we're both mixing the same project.
Cool.
Crazy.
Yeah, Andrew's
And that's 25 years.
wonderful, and he's been a wonderful
Super
guest
guy.
on the show as well.
Yeah.
And he, you know, like you joining us on this podcast now, I mean, Andrew's been so involved in the present day community and learning and students and
Oh yeah,
becoming a teacher. It's been a lot of fun to have
I
him.
learned a lot from him for sure back then.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's cool to hear you talk about, you know, his start with synclavier, your start with drum machines. It's just that reminder that it's cool to just get good at some of the technology as we start out and bring that as an asset to a session as well.
yeah. I think that more often than not, like things that I didn't think were going to come in handy came in handy. And that goes to like, you know, learning a Kai MPC 60 and just learning enough to get around it. You know, a lot of times on a session, you're the problem solver as an engineer.
Yep.
You know, there might be a guy that comes to do a beat and he's like, I can't get my MPC to work. And if you had a little bit of knowledge of how to troubleshoot something or fix it, you could really save the day. And I don't think those things, being like a learning addict, I think those kind of things always came my way as far as like, oh yeah, I know how to get at least the basics of that figured out, whether it's Logic Audio or Reason or Pro Tools or any other, you know, an Akai MPC, all those types of things. They turn into work. You know, they make clients happy.
Yeah, and sometimes it's knowing the boring stuff about those elements too, because you know, it's like knowing how to turn on the time code feature and getting it to come out, you know, come out the right output.
Yeah, simple stuff.
That's where you solve it. So what are some things that you remember learning from Bruce Swedien and the Michael Jackson session? You know, I mean, one of the two things that I remember hearing about the way he might work was using stereo mics and not using compression. Is there any legitimacy to that?
I wasn't really totally around him for that kind of stuff. I was actually mostly in the other room where we actually recorded everything.
Okay.
Aside from like the occasional moment where Bruce would record something. Yeah, I can go out there and tell you that, like, you know, Bruce took credit for a lot of stuff that he didn't do. And didn't give Eddie Delana credit for a lot of stuff that he did. And myself, like, my name was never allowed on a track sheet, even though if I recorded 8 hours a night.
Wow.
Yeah, there was a very strange time where there was a lot of credit hoarding to try and get Grammy awards for best engineered albums. That was a time when that whole thing had hit the fan, where you had to be the engineer of more than 50% of a record to get best engineered.
Wow.
So there was some hoarding. Now, on Bruce's, the stuff that I did get from Bruce was like, you know, Bruce was very good at, he had a specific way of working on an SSL that was interesting. He was I definitely learned from him how the importance of high pass and low pass filters. It was like, it was his game. It was definitely a big part of his arsenal. He also tended to go on the brighter side all the time. Crispy bright. He also was a guy who it was not beyond him to, you'd come in and go in the control room and he was like listening to something contemporary because he was literally A-Bing and saying like, what people were up to. Many years, Bruce Swedien, like big famous, fancy, super duper famous mixing engineer, working with Michael Jackson. Yet he's referencing stuff and seeing like where the trends are. They were big on that in the whole Michael Jackson camp. They would listen to the top 40 of each week, every week, and
That's
literally
fascinating.
literally monitor everything and see like what things were sounding like and why, and how they could, just stay relevant,
Yeah.
or stay ahead of that. You know,
What would you say about the high pass low pass filters? What were some things you remember learning? What did that experience feel like? What when you first discovered something? What was your aha moment around that stuff?
um, like a lot of stuff, particularly like say in the keyboard area, and Michael Jackson was a lot of keyboards. A lot of those synthesizers and keyboards tend to have patches, particularly the presets, that are like full range, like super low end all the way to super top end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going back to my music store experience. I think that's to literally wow the person in the store, to go, wow, that's the biggest Rhodes sound I've ever heard. That's the biggest string pad I've ever heard. But that doesn't fit in a record if it's going to fit in with drums and bass instruments and vocals and guitars and cymbals. And the thing that I learned from Bruce was that Rhodes needs to get out of the way on the low end, and all that super sizzly stuff on that particular instrument might actually be just adding to high end noise at the top. So you need to filter that off and filter out the low end and create its space by subtraction as opposed to addition.
How do you do that today? I mean, I imagine you're using software synths
Yeah,
more often than hardware.
I think the first thing I reach for is the filter on basically everything.
On the synth itself, or do you
On
just sort of
everything.
put a EQ after it?
Yeah, vocals, guitars. Acoustic guitar is another notorious low end grabber.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants to hear this gigantic acoustic guitar when they first put the microphone in front of it. It was like, yeah, that does sound cool if it was going to be the only thing. But realistically, where's it going to be in the mix when you're trying to add piano, bass, and vocal with that? So there goes the low end off that thing. It it was definitely an aha moment of learning how to create space for getting that big kick drum and kick and bass guitar sound or synth bass sound, and creating room. Background vocals, same thing. Uh, I recently was asked by somebody who was having trouble with one of their mixes, like, I can't get the background vocals to pop, and I have stacks and this and that. So I heard the mix. I was like, I don't know, what do you have the background vocals rolled off at? I said like 110, 100. And honestly, I was like, well, did you try going up? Maybe 220, 240?
Mm-hmm.
And the guy tried it and called me back like an hour later and was like, I can't even believe it. Like I actually could turn down the compression and turn up the vocals because it was all the low end that was just creating this density that was just too much. Like, well, I mean, that was definitely a Swedian thing, and even a Clear Mountain thing. I got to assist him for like a 2-day thing, and I mean, I probably learned more in 2 or 3 days working with Clear Mountain. Or actually, I didn't even do anything. I just sat there and watched him and his assistant. I was like kind of like an engineer who was there as a favor to the Hit Factory, and I just saw how someone like Clear Mountain worked early on, in that it was just like a less is more approach. Levels were important, balance, panning. I think then there basically would be like filtering, compression to solve a problem, and then maybe some EQ for additive things like, oh, I need to brighten this thing up or cut out a little mid range or boost a little upper mids on something. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think it tends, I tend to notice that even as I go along, things are just a lot simpler than they're made out to be.
Especially if the production's done
It's
well, right?
if the production's done well, and if the recording is done well, then the mixing part of it, I mean, it should you be able to get a pretty good semblance of what the mix would be with just faders? I believe that. I believe that. And then all the rest of it is to tweak.
How
I think
often are you filtering at the recording stage so that it's printed that way versus letting the filtering be part of, the first plugin in Pro Tools, for example?
yeah, I mean, I do it on stuff that I know I can commit to. Like, okay, I'm definitely not going to need anywhere from 160 down on this female vocal. I'll just get it over with and just do it. Uh, Acoustic guitar, same thing. I won't go as nuts on, say, an acoustic. Maybe I'll just make sure that I'm rolled off from 60 down or something, just to make sure there's no unnecessary rumble.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I don't do a lot. I don't do a lot of tracking at this point. Um, I did a band just before the pandemic hit on a VR, and I once again I take the less is more approach. I just kind of get things legitimately captured and keep it simple and keep the actual music flowing, as
Yeah.
opposed to getting in the way of going for some magical thing that the keyboard player is going to be forgetting what the chord progression is by the time I move the mics around.
So for those of us with our home studio getups
Mhm.
where we've got our one mic and it's a mic pre, straight into the interface,
Mhm.
like green light to just go ahead and record whatever you're feeling that way, because you can start experimenting with the filtering afterwards, and it may not
Yeah,
take as much as you think.
yeah. I mean, if you have one mic and you're just recording in a home studio and you haven't figured out a decent setting in the first 4 hours, you probably have other issues.
Yeah.
So I do think that one or two mics in a project studio setup is more than enough to basically do everything, um, and have it sound really incredible. Whether it's like one SM7 for doing vocals when you need them to be intimate, and a decent condenser microphone to do acoustic guitars and a couple other things, and maybe other vocals if the room is quiet enough, because a lot of people have to deal with things like air conditioners in the room and stuff like that now, um, if they're working out of a project studio or out of their home.
Hmm.
And that's where I think some aside from turning the air conditioner off and sweating for an hour and a half while you're doing the vocal and keeping headphones on and all that, uh, something simple like an SM7 or an RE20 could really save you a lot of headaches, and you certainly are going to get a good vocal tone. I mean, that's Rock With You, I believe, was an SM7, and
Yeah.
early Michael Jackson stuff. Even some of the stuff we did, we used an SM7 too.
So when Carl Nappa was on the show, he talked
Mm.
about recording Nelly in St.
Yeah.
Louis, and he just said, like we just set up in well, I can't remember if he set it up or he advised Nelly to do it, but it was like go into the closet where all the clothes are, put your
Yeah.
vocal mic in there, and it's like a perfect vocal booth for dead vocal sounds. Maybe a
Yeah,
little
that
bit
would be
toasty.
yeah, that would be dead for sure. I
Yeah.
don't know. It it depends on the vocalist. I mean, certainly you don't want like some crazy ambience on your recorded vocal, right? Because you really have nowhere to go from there.
Yeah, unless you love the sound of it, I guess then you're committing to that.
That's gonna be trouble.
The secret to a great mix is to start with great source tracks, and this means you need great microphones. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia brings you the new BB29 Signature Series microphone to help your recordings add clarity and detail to your mixes. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique Golden Drop capsule design with a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity without distracting colorations and distortions. The new BB29 microphone has a Class A discrete amplifier circuit, extremely low self-noise, and transformer-coupled output to bring an expensive sound to your studio for an affordable price. JZ offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, you can use the coupon code ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the BB29 at jzmic.com. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Want to start mastering your own records? Rockstars of Mastering walks you through exactly how I mastered my own record using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. Want to learn how to create a mix that doesn't suck but rocks instead? At Mixmaster Bundle, I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins so that you can have punchy, powerful drums, guitars that rock, bass you can feel, and a mix that is in your face. Plus, it's totally free as my way of saying thanks for listening. Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now and look for the clickable link in the show notes below. You've done a lot of hip-hop records, you know. You sort of, as you said, you moved on through those. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about Low End. What are some things, you know, when I go listen to hip hop records and I think about questions to ask you too, I typically hear, you know, the bed track, the loops, and then I hear vocals and vocal treatments and arrangement. And, you know, of course, a lot to say about a record is just the lyrics themselves. But what about the low end and stuff that you've learned about, you know, the evolution of records from old school hip hop or the 90s hip hop to what it means today, and also how you just sort of arrive at a decision about what the correct amount of low end is on a record.
I mean, it's clearly evolved from when we were using tape and when there were no subwoofers in cars, and then when you actually had to, you know, account for the idea that it was going to be on cassette. There was definitely low end that was not available. When the CD started really taking off, obviously the low end thing became the flavor of the day, because it's you could finally have all that crazy stuff on the bottom. Did
the low end change with the increasing loudness wars also, or like did you lose room for low end as a result of that?
I guess so. When hip hop kind of in the 90s, I found it to be not so much that there was so much low end, it's just that the overall thing was darker. Like the overall mixes were darker. That could have had something to do with being on tape. It could have had something to do with tape degradation. I mean, if you're running a tape for 5 hours straight while it's looping, while a guy's writing a rhyme, I mean, that thing is just like, you know, losing quality as it goes along, and you're never going to get back all that sizzle. And then, you know, then it goes to the point where it's being mixed and that tape is kind of old. That went away when we went to digital, because then all of a sudden you weren't getting any any frequency loss from the tape. So, but those 90s things were like darker, didn't necessarily have the crazy low end that we have available now. And I think we're in a weird spot where right now, I don't know if low end is, I don't know if it's crazy important right now because so many people listen on buds. And I don't know if there's been a big shift since, maybe late 90s to, early 2000s to now. I think it's about the same. And then the volume thing, I don't really know. I mean, I play games with the volume thing. And I recently started this project that I mentioned, Slow Down the Quick, where it's allowing me a little bit of freedom in that I'm actually mastering and uploading to Spotify and SoundCloud. So I'm experimenting too at the same time and seeing what I'm getting away with or not getting away with on a volume level
Mm-hmm.
thing. And I hear these things that are out there, like, don't go above -14 because you're going to get penalized by SoundCloud or Spotify. And, I wonder if that is somewhat to sort of control people, in that they know, when an aspirin company says only take 2 every 6 hours, they know that you can get away with 3, but they say 2 because they know people are going to take 3. And I think in the case of this volume thing, if they put it out there like, try and don't go above -14, it's because you could really go to -10.
Right.
But they don't want to tell everybody that, because then those people are going to go to -6.
Have you explored this? You may or may not know about this one, but there's a plugin put out by Ian Shepherd at Meter Plugs called Loudness Penalty, and then Dynameter is another one. But Loudness Penalty is a plugin you can put into Pro Tools, and it will show you how the different streaming sites will bring up or down. I think mostly it'll show you how it'll bring down the volume. Maybe it'll bring it up too.
Mhm.
On track, so you can hear it. You can press the button, you can hear it, and you know, imitate the
Yeah.
track being turned down and stuff. So
I've heard about that one. I use that one, you lean, or you learn loudness, or you mean
oh, okay,
loudness, or something.
okay.
Once in a while, just to take a look. But I use Isotope a lot, and I just look at the LUFS
Mhm.
readouts on that,
Yeah,
and kind of, and like I said, I think everybody has that advantage now, is that they could upload stuff themselves. You could even, play around and have a different account and upload something just to test things, um, and see what happens, and see where you're at if you're doing your own mastering.
yeah,
Um, I'm I'm having okay success with numbers that are higher than the -14, and I'm not seeing the penalties. Um, and then I guess there is also that thing of, well, if you're using the auto level correction thing or whatever on Spotify or on Apple Music, isn't that making it louder if it's too soft? I guess, right?
hmm
Uh, the loudness game is funny. I think I heard Andrew Shep say it on something, like he just goes loud.
right,
And honestly, I think I do too. I just make sure that there's a livable amount of distortion, or nothing crazy, where when I throw it in the mono and turn it down low, I don't hear anything that just turns my stomach, and then just try and get it pumping.
yeah. I mean, the funny thing about the idea of the loudness wars is everything that people say about things getting too loud makes some sense. Everything that people say about the live streaming turning things down, and you think you made it loud, but you didn't, make sense. But in the end, every time every time you push a little bit, you just find out where that threshold is and push that mix up to it. It always just
Mhm.
sounds better. So it's always a question of figuring out what it is. And I like your suggestion about upload it. You listen to
Yeah,
it yourself, because ultimately that's today's version of the car jam. It's just you have
yeah,
to have the
yeah,
jam box, the car jam, whatever it is that makes you go, okay, now we got it.
yeah.
And live streaming is part of that.
Occasionally, I'll sit with like a younger guy, engineer, mixer, producer guy, and kind of check out what they're doing or whatever, and typically they'll ask me like some questions like, what about this? Like, how would you get this brighter or whatever? And it's funny, I don't know whether it's because of all the overload of info, like via YouTube and the net, the net itself in general, blogs. I think there's paralysis by analysis kind of thing. And we're like, very simply, I'll say to the kid, like, well, what happens if you take, whatever you got boosting 4K, what happens if you like go from 2 dB to 10 dB? What happens? Well, I don't know. I've never tried. And there's like this hesitancy, like, well, I've heard that that's crazy to go crazy with the knobs. And I couldn't disagree more with that. I mean, that's all I did when I was learning was explore the limits of everything. Whether when I did find out about filters, go nuts, just filter out like crazy and see where the breaking point is. And I think with the volume thing, you can kind of do that same thing. Same thing with compression. Like, I know you've read that 2-to-1 is this and that, and 4-to-1 is going to give you this sound or whatever. But like, the first thing I would want to do would be just let me hear it all the way this way and all the way that way and in between, just to see all the different reactions.
Love it. I'm glad you just said that. I probably just said that on the last interview myself too.
Is that right?
Well, I agree 100%. I try and tell interns that it's like, if you're not sure what something does, turn it all the way to the one side and all the way to the other. If you don't hear anything, it doesn't do anything.
Yeah. I mean, and especially with the digital readouts of things. I mean, the numbers, and to a certain extent, don't mean anything to me. Like plus 12 dB on something or minus 30 dB on something. Like, it's a visual representation of something that they're doing with an algorithm and software. If you put a scope on it, is it exactly that? I don't even know. I think it's just a matter of whether what it sounds like.
Yeah. And when you're creating a record, when you're mixing something, it's important that it has some relevance to what another record sounds like, but kind of only if you just heard the other record. Because if you turn on the record you're listening to now, that's the only record you're listening to, and it just needs to be exciting, right?
Yeah. It's funny, like that whole referencing thing. I don't think, like in the case of like someone like Bruce, I don't think he was thinking, oh, I'm going to make my thing sound sonically exactly like this. Just as, say, when I walk around listening to music just while taking a walk, I think it's all a matter of sort of a subconscious thing where like you just hear balances, you hear relationships between drums and bass and vocals and the entire instrumentation, and it becomes a subconscious thing that you actually have a feel for what levels are correct or like what you like to hear. Could I A/B something in my speakers and literally match it? Definitely. We used to have to do that type of thing. If we had to recall a mix back in the day, you had a copy of the actual finished mix, and then you had the let's just say the whole entire breakout of the session on the console. And before you were able to fix the thing that you were supposed to fix by recalling the entire thing, you would have to A/B the finished mix to the one that you just reconstructed on the desk, and learn to hear the differences. Like, okay, that snare drum's just a little lower than the mix, and bring it up a little bit, and lower that hi-hat, and oh, the panning is a little off. So could you duplicate somebody else's mix on it? Technically, I think you could, but I think listening, and I do think that a lot of people don't listen enough anymore. In my experience, is that you lose a sense of like what balances are and what relationships are between instruments if you aren't a big listener. You're living in sort of like your own echo chamber if you're only listening to stuff you work on.
Yeah, that's good advice. And then, also with all the minutia of comparisons of different sounds and mixes, we listen to something else, we change our mix, we keep working on it, keep tweaking it. You get to the end of the day, and it's like, do those differences, is that going to make this person over here like this song any better or not?
That's the big question, right? I mean, I can listen to 50 different things on Spotify that I really love that sonically are just completely different than each other.
Yeah.
And could I say that any one of those mixes are like hurting or helping the situation? I don't know. I don't even know. That's why I don't even really understand something like really, I really don't understand is the thing of like best engineered album. I don't, or best engineered record. I don't get that at all. Like that is just what is the perspective? If I'm recording Paul Simon and like some of the world's greatest musicians, does that make my record the best engineered? Or is it like the guy who didn't screw up recording the best musicians in the world award? You know,
and also, what about the guy who engineered that band that nobody ever heard of, but boy, did he kill it.
Yeah. And why did that happen? Or is something like Jagged Little Pill the best engineered album of all time because they sold 25 million records of a thing that was recorded on ADAT in a house in the 93, 94. So that's a weird area. I've always said that, like, of course, and I have a lot of respect for all those guys, especially from the 70s, but like, of course, it's going to sound pretty good when Quincy Jones is producing and all the guys from Toto are playing and Michael Jackson is singing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, unless you are inept, it's going to sound pretty good. And what does it mean that it was best engineered? You magically put a microphone in front of Steve Porcaro playing keyboards or Jeff Porcaro playing drums? I mean,
yeah. Maybe they need a worst engineered. They need a worst engineered category. So when the Michael Jackson record comes out that doesn't sound very good, you get the worst engineered.
Imagine that. Yeah, like it's a fascinating thing. The whole award thing in itself is a mind-boggling thing. I mean, writers give each other awards for bravery. I mean, and then in the music industry, we give each other awards for best engineered non-classical, and then best engineered classical. I mean, it's all showbiz.
Yeah, it is. I think the awards are so that you can put it in front of your name and hopefully get more work and everybody thrives.
Guilty.
So let me try this. So we're coming up near the end of the show here. I'm trying to think of a good way to ask this question. How about I'm just going to say some of the names of artists you work with, and when you feel like telling a story about one of them that pops into your head, just cut me off and jump in. Jay-Z.
Focused and extremely driven.
Did he write his lyrics down, or did he famously not write his lyrics down?
I mean, every time I saw him, or every time I recorded him, which was a bunch of times, doing his vocals, I don't remember him having a piece of paper. No, I think he did memorize the stuff.
Lil Kim.
Lil Kim was an innocent, interesting character. I mean, I worked with her when she was really little. And just like this, I think she might have been 18 or 19 years old. And she was like a fun person to be around, but, was in a big world and was just trying to like understand like what the hell she was. I don't even know if she knew what she was involved in when she was, while we were making that record.
Discovery. That was Hardcore was the one that you made with her?
Yeah. Yeah. Her whole first album.
Missy Elliott.
Not a great person.
Okay. Wu-Tang Clan.
Completely in their own world. What was interesting?
Only band to sell one record for $1 million.
I thought that, they kind of, I actually thought of something stupid like that before that even happened. And it was just like one of those things like they did it. You know what's interesting about them and a lot of hip hop was that it was very everything was peer tested. Everything was about like I'm trying to do better than the other guy. I'm trying to outdo you, not in a like I want to like take your job, but like I'm going to show you I can bring it. And I think a lot of that energy was really why hip hop was as good as it was then, because it was literally about like trying to break ground all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you a dumb question. What is Wu-Tang Clan?
I mean, it's a collection of what 9 rappers, or I don't remember at this point what the number is. What is it?
So, yeah, I mean, just to give you a chance to explain it to everybody, especially anybody who is not familiar yet. But
I mean,
wasn't it was it a kind of a rotating door, or was it an evolving collective all the time?
I mean, there was a set membership. You know, there was a certain amount of members. I think it was 9, and they were just a hip hop group that would just rotate whoever they felt was right for that part of whatever beat they were rapping to. That's who got on. Or sometimes it was just competitive. It'd be like, you know, no, your verse isn't as good as so and so's. We're going to use this one, this verse, and this verse from these 3 guys on this particular song. And whoever does the best gets on the records. Listen, the idea that they had that many guys and they were able to keep that functioning and together is kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. I mean, I don't know how the hell they did it. It was chaos a lot of times. I mean, I worked on I mixed Ghostface's first album uncredited because the credits were already printed, like all the artwork was already done. It had been mixed once, and they, before manufacturing it, they decided like they hated the mix. So I remixed all the songs in like 8 days straight with Ghostface and Raekwon. And while I'm mixing, which was on analog tape, each guy was showing up wanting to redo his verses that were on their album, on Ghostface's album. So like I'm 80% into a mix and Master Killer shows up and is like, yo, Ghost, I want to redo my verse. And the next thing you know, you're recording a verse in a mix and then trying to, and also explaining to them like, listen, you know, this is on tape and, you know, there was no digital then. If we record your vocal over, like the old one's gone.
Wow.
Because we didn't have safeties and stuff like that. So it was that much of a sort of like a free for all. And that's what I'm saying. Like a lot of it was like a miracle that it all came together that it did it all. Because right up to the last minute, you were re-recording stuff because they decided they could do better, and there was no saying no. Like, you know,
do you thank coffee for your success?
Yeah, man, I've drank a lot of coffee in my day, a lot of bad coffee.
And this is probably like, you know, 3 in the morning when the request is coming in.
Oh yeah, 3, 4, yeah. Yeah, usually it wouldn't be 8 o'clock.
So now, Roger Mutino is another New Jersey engineer, friend of mine down here in Nashville, and he talked about doing, I think it was Run DMC sessions early on, and he said, I believe his story was something along the lines of working with him for 6 months in the studio, and the SSL volume knob was just dimed the entire time. And he said he just couldn't take it anymore at a certain point.
Yeah, and that was
that a thing?
I was talking with Carl about that. That was back when we had you. I mean, I never worked with that Run DMC. They were just a little before my time, but all the studios back then had these horrendous Yori monitors, and there was no subwoofer in sight. So in order to get any kind of low end, which there really wasn't a lot of, you would just turn it all the way up. And you can only imagine how bright and loud things were. I mean, it was just horrific.
Maybe that's why the records were mixed dark.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Yeah, there was definitely some of that. Yeah.
Luther Vandross.
Uh, um, Probably the most talented singer I've ever worked with. Super great guy. Um, Tremendous vocal. Like never heard him even miss a note. And he would do multiple takes, and each one you'd be saying to yourself, well, why am I recording more? Like, we had it the first take. But he just had an incredible ear and knew specifically what he wanted out of his vocal and knew how to get it, and was able to scrutinize on a different level uh, than most people could hear. And this was, prior to tuning vocals and things like that.
Share a vocal mixing technique that might have applied to Luther or some of the other breathy, airy singers that you would have worked with.
Well, he had exquisite mic control. So once again, that would be another case of just staying out of the way. He typically had used an AKG 414 for most of his career, and then one day I was recording him, and I don't know whether he had asked me out of curiosity what vocal mic Mariah was using, and I told him, oh, she's using the Sony C800G typically. And he's like, do you have one of those that I can try? And he switched to that mic. He liked it so much when he heard it. But he just, he had that sound, whether it was on a 414 or even like if an SM58, that voice had that breathiness, that those reedy vocal chords that would just, sound velvety, and he had the control to basically do whatever he wanted.
Did you play around with the kind of the or the encoded Dolby A trick? I think that was one I remember hearing where that would get blended back in with the vocal to kind of give it some more air.
Yeah, I never did it. Never did it.
All
That
right.
was a little ahead of my
Right
learning.
on.
That was pre like, my typical stuff that I was doing, and I never really got into all that the super nerd stuff, to be honest with you. I was always kind of pushing, or have still, I'm pushing to like what's new, as opposed to like old tricks.
Nice.
Yeah. I mean, I'm dying to try like the slate microphone, like the modeling thing, and
Mm-hmm.
like to me, that's like that kind of stuff excites me, in the idea of like, okay, I could see that being where we're heading. I could see that. I like the idea that the SM7 just came out with a USB version. It's like you can go between both.
I hadn't seen that yet. I'm gonna have to
Yeah,
get one of
they
those.
have it's a dynamic mic and a USB mic. Yeah.
Very cool. Bruce Springsteen.
Bruce Springsteen, um, again, very focused, very, we're talking about artists that would come in and command the attention of the entire room, and also not be distracted by anything else but their music in the moment. Um, and also on the same token, like respectful of everyone in the room, that everyone was there to try and help them. And I guess if they picked up on it that you were there for any other reason than helping them achieve their goal, then you would probably not be there.
Right. So that was one of the topics that you had discussed with me previously, the idea of focusing and learning to work without distractions. Do you want to reference anything that you've adopted for your own method?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to keep things separate. While I'm working, I'm not engaged in social media or texting or talking on the phone while I'm doing something. And I do see that as a big problem in the environment today, like in anybody's studio, or especially being that the fact that people can just work home alone or in a project studio, that they lose a sense of how valuable time is because they feel like they have all the time in the world because they're in a place where the clock's not running. Um, and that's the challenge of working either alone or without a budget restriction or without without a label, without a management team saying like, hey, this thing needs to be handed in tonight. Um, it baffles me when I see an artist working on their own record who's also texting and Instagramming at the same time. Like, there's just no way that you're not. I mean, it's just simple math. You're distracted.
Yeah.
You know?
De La Soul.
They were. I briefly remember working with them. They were just very intellectual guys who were, commentating on society and aware of like societal things. That was like the whole very intellectual hip hop kind of thing, in my opinion.
Heavy D.
Another super easygoing, focused guy who had a flow that he found a flow that was his thing and just did it really well.
Timbaland.
I first encountered, he was basically Devontae Swing's like friend who would just come to Jodeci sessions and he would just like watch and hang around. I had no idea the guy even was interested in making music when I first encountered him for like a year. And then Jodeci went their way and he disappeared. And then eventually I found out like Timbaland was making beats. And I was like, wait a minute, Timbaland, the guy that used to like drive into the studio with Devontae and just hang out? Like, yeah. And I got to work with him again on Alicia's record because he did a track on Diary. And it was another one of those moments where you're like, remember Studio C at the Hit Factory with Devontae? That was me. What? Like you have a few of those moments here and there where you get back reconnected with people after 10 years or something like that. And it's always a trip.
That's awesome.
It's got a great ear. Yeah. Obviously.
Yeah, I've enjoyed what I've heard of his work. Do you feel like the time you spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen, I appreciate you listening to this podcast, and I know you're trying to make your best record ever. But when you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then you're ready for UltimateMixingMasterclass.com. Well, so let me close out on the interview here. I'll throw a couple of these quick topics at you too that you had mentioned because I'm sure you have something cool to say about it. One of the lines you talked about deadlines and Seth Godin and stuff you learned about that. Importance of deadlines. I feel like that's related to focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, mostly working on indie releases now and self-financed projects and things like that. One of the biggest problems I see is a project that doesn't have a goal as far as a release date or a launch date, or as Seth Godin would call it, a shipping date. And without those points, beacons in the future, it always lends itself to someone kicking the can further down the road and either getting stale on the material that they're been working on or never releasing it, out of boredom or overdoing it, and coming up with new excuses as to why to not just put it out. And that, I mean, it's an epidemic in the indie world.
Guilty as charged over here.
Okay.
You're reminding me to finish my EP.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Out.
Thank you. Don't be precious about your story regarding someone else's story.
Yeah. To me, that's especially as a mixer, and we're talking a lot about obviously mixing and being the recording engineer, is I hear from peers and from even not so much from peers, even from producers, where they take it personally if the artist asks for something different than what they delivered. So you get finished with the mix, you send it to the artist, and you get comments back like, "Wow, I want the Rhodes to be loud and that acoustic guitar to be way underneath it." And you had it, obviously the opposite way, and you take it personally as opposed to saying, "Well, that's what they want, and that's how I have to make that work. I have to figure out a way to make that work and get out of your own head that your way is the only way that this thing should have sounded." That's the precious part.
Know when to say yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say no all the time. It just out of paranoia or fear or whatever. But I think saying yes to projects or to requests from an artist or from another producer, yes, I can do that. Yes, I'll figure out a way to do that. Yes, I'll be there. I mean, all those kind of things are doors that lead you to the next thing that you're going to be doing without you even realizing it.
Okay, so instinct, you're talking about the importance of trusting your own instinct.
Yeah, that's I think that's something related particularly to mixing. I feel like, there's always a question of like, when is the mix done? I feel like when I could play the mix back for myself, and there isn't that moment where in my gut I go, "Ooh, that was that too loud there?" When I ask that question, that to me that means it is, and that's like an instinct thing where maybe it's like a learned thing that you have to learn to trust some instincts on, or all your instincts on, whether something is done, and also the instinct of saying like, "Yeah, that is done." My instincts say I've reached that point where it's good to go, and launch that EP and hit send on DistroKid so that it goes to all the streaming services.
I love it. I'm glad you brought up DistroKid. I really dig their site.
Yeah, it's cool, right?
And you had shared a quote which goes with that from that just says, "You never finish a song or art, you only abandon it."
Yeah, that's Sting.
That's great.
That's a great. I heard that years ago, and I was like, that makes a lot of sense. Like, how, you could, I mean, even as a mixer, you could mix something for the next year, if no one ever tapped you on the shoulder and said like, "By the way, it's got to go." And then sometimes you have to be the guy that taps yourself on the shoulder and says like, "Yeah, it's time to send it to the client. It's time to move on," or tap yourself on the shoulder and say like, "You didn't finish this one yet." A lot of times it's an inner dialogue.
Well, the great thing to me about that quote is you only abandon it. It gives you permission to finish it, knowing that you're gonna still feel like there's something you could have done, and that's okay.
And I think you're always. I think probably everyone you've probably interviewed probably would say that, is that like, anytime you hear something that you did several years ago, you're like, "Ooh, I would do this. Ooh, I wish I could get my hands on that to do this."
Or you're like, "Oh my God, how did I get it sound so good on an ADAT?"
Right. It's funny. There are things that I've heard from like, I don't know, 23 years ago that I'm like, how did we, you know, I kind of think in a we context because like there's like you were there with your assistant, you're the producer, and I'm like, how did we get it to sound that way? Because like it sounds a lot like stuff today. And I know we didn't have all the easy fix it stuff that's at your disposal today. It was very hard to get to get a good hip hop kick drum sound back then. Now it's like literally, you could trip over 50 of them on the internet. You go on Splice or something like that and find anything you need to find. So that does trip me out once in a while to hear like those old records and go like, I know what we were using and how we were using it. I think like someone like Tony Maserati will tell you like he's been getting the same good kick drum sound since 1993, and without all the tools that you have now.
So last question, and then I'll go to my closing one. But this one is topic from you. Work with people that challenge you. You're the sum of the 5 people around you.
Really, yeah, I truly believe that you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time around or associate with, and if you're in today's world where you're not necessarily around 5 people all the time, I think you can use things like something like your podcast, where it's like 5 influences that you can use to get better and learn and be better. So if you find a great blog or podcast that will help, and another guy's website that will help, and a book, that's a way of having those 5 people be your 5 people, as opposed to the 5 guys that hang out down at the local bar who are not going to help you get better.
Yeah. The problem with friends and family is sometimes they don't want you to move on to success.
They can be the naysayers. Yeah. You got to avoid those.
Okay, so this is our last question. Tony, thank you also so much for joining us and going way overtime on this too. This question is hypothetical, but we're going to take the Wayback Studio machine. You're going to go back and find your young self playing around with drum machines, maybe staying up all night in the music store. And of course you walk in and your young self's like, holy shit, what are you doing here? Store's supposed to be closed. But you say, listen, dude, I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice would you go back and give yourself if you could?
Learn sales. Everything is selling.
Nice. You're like, dude, open the store back up. What are you doing?
Learn sales. No, I mean, everything is sales in the context that you're trying to sell your ideas on whatever it is you're doing. You're trying to sell yourself to whoever's interested in hiring you, and there's always someone else above you, unless you become. And even then, if you became Jimmy Iovine, you're still trying to sell to the public. So there's always that element of sales that is just a reality. And I think that it's show business, and it's a music business. And I think a lot of people lose track of the idea that it's actually business and it's sales. And I lost awareness of that here and there for sure, and got caught up in the preciousness of like, but what about my mix,
right?
As opposed to figuring out a way to connect to the customer.
Good advice. For the next podcast, we can dig deeper into ways that we can do that. I think it's a moving target. It's the same concept, but it's always like moving target because of technology and websites and all that kind of stuff. Social media.
For sure.
Tony, thank you again so much for hanging with us, dude. What an awesome hang. It's really a blast to just listen to you share the stories about working with all these great artists, your experiences. Cool. And again, thank you for putting in the extra time. Let the rock stars know where can they go find you online? Where would you like them to go check out your work? What if they need to make their next big hit record with you?
My website is tonyblackprod.com, short for productions, but it's tonyblackprod.com. I just started a new music project called Slow Down the Quick. That's slowdownthequick.com. And I'm on like Blacksby at Instagram, and that kind of covers it. I don't really do Twitter all so much. And if anybody needs to contact me, they can contact me through my website for mixing or production or whatever.
Awesome, dude. Well, again, a great hang with you, man. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, man. Cheers. Can't wait to meet you in person.
Yes, same here.
Cheers. Okay. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who help make this episode possible. Sound Porter Mastering, OWC, Atom Audio, Spectra 1964, Isotope, and JZ Microphones. Remember to get your free mastering demo at soundporter.com and use the coupon codes ROCK10 at Isotope for an additional 10% off, and ROCKSTARS at jzmic.com for 50% off the BB29 for a limited time. You'll find links to all these wonderful sponsors in our show notes. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to give a big thank you to our rockstar team here at Recording Studio Rockstars, Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and Hugh McDonald for additional podcasts and video production. You guys rock. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.